Picture this, you're facing a critical deadline and the pressure is on and you have to make a quick decision with limited information. My business startup leaders, does this sound familiar? Decision-making in a startup can feel like navigating a minefield blindfolded, but it doesn't have to be that way. Welcome to Manage Chaos, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Rachel Anderson.
And I'm Katrina Purcell.
And today, we're equipping you with the tools and strategies to make better decisions faster, even in the midst of chaos.
So you know how I'm teaching this operations management class?
Yeah.
And this week we covered decision making.
Nice.
Super fun topic, right?
Okay.
And so at the beginning, I asked the class, tell me about some decisions that you've made this week. And so one of the students starts talking about this decision that he made about a long distance girlfriend.
Ooh.
Well, it was really funny when we started getting into the types of decision processes, right? So we go over analytical, we go, and then we start talking about behavioral decision making. And you should have seen his face when he realized what decision-making methodology he had used to make this decision. And the whole class is laughing at that point of like, guess you didn't really make an analytical decision about staying in this long distance relationship.
That's amazing.
And I felt really bad because I had unintentionally sort of called him out because he had been willing to talk about the decision that he had to make that week.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Did anybody have like a really small decision? Like I had to decide if I was going to brush my teeth.
No. And when I tell you, it's an undergraduate class and I'm always really pushing for participation. But yeah, sometimes they go full out. Like one person said, I was deciding whether or not to go to college. I'm like, well, surely you weren't deciding that this week. You're already here. You're a senior.
You're here. I think you've decided. That's awesome. Oh, poor guy. He'll never forget that lesson though.
He will never forget the lesson. And maybe next time he will think about all the different ways he could have made decision and, move in and out of different decision-making and methodologies.
Oh my God, that's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Well, I think that's also a perfect way to ask the very first question, which is, what are some common decision-making traps? And how can we relate that to our startup founders? What do they fall into? And how do they know that they can avoid them?
Yeah. So those of us who really like to make, analytical decisions, who think of ourselves as analytical decision makers can definitely fall into analysis paralysis. And so it's right. I'm the biggest overanalyzer,
So
right? Yeah, exactly. And it can lead you in some cases to not act. Right? Because you can be looking for all the pieces of information. You can be really struggling to process all that information. And if you know that's who you are, my best advice there is to really set deadlines, right? Break down the decisions maybe into smaller steps where they don't feel as large and looming, right? And in a little way, start to learn to trust your gut, not too much that you ignore details and facts, but trust it. Confirmation bias. This is one my class really, for whatever reason, they've learned. We've talked about it quite a bit, but this one they know now. And it's really just seeking out information that confirms your beliefs, right? So you're not going to reach out to people that you know are going to disagree with you, which leads you to sometimes make really poor decisions because you're not actually taking in all the different evidence. You really should actively seek out diverse perspectives. And I know this can be somewhat touchy subject, right? If you already have made a decision, it's much more, comforting to know that people agree with it. But in reality, learning at the very beginning and having your assumptions challenged early on is actually a much more effective way to make sure that you're making a good decision. Sunk cost bias or sunk cost fallacy. I've already spent so much time, so much money, so much XYZ. I just shouldn't change direction. I shouldn't pivot. Please in life, cut that just from your life, right? Like, do you know how many people I know who have been in relationships were like, well, I've invested all this time in this relationship. Okay, but are you happy? Let me tell you, you're not going to get happier, right? So really being willing to cut your loss, being willing to pivot, emotional decision-making or behavioral decision-making, right? So letting fear, stress, excitement, letting the crowd swell, kind of dictate your decision-making. It's good to be in touch with your emotions. It's good to understand your emotions, but it's also good to kind of take that step back, gain perspective, get those diverse perspectives, and really use that to make a holistic decision.
I think these are really timely. I was trying to decide what word I wanted to use, but I think I think that this conversation we're having is really timely because I'm thinking about all of these and I'm just thinking about the state of our world at the moment. And it just feels really applicable as a human experiencing life, right? Like, I loved your example, especially of like being in a relationship and the sunk cost fallacy. Like, yes, you feel like there's this slot machine, so to speak, where you're sitting at the table or at the machine game and you're like, if I just keep like pulling this, it eventually has to be a jackpot. And I don't want to not be here when it finally gets the jackpot. But in the meantime, you might be wasting millions and millions of dollars to just get $1,000, right? And so I think that having these different things really at the forefront of your mind is such a good place for us to start in this conversation. And I even want to call out a little bit this idea that one of the ways to really help you as you think about these within your startup leader context is like the earlier you can do the things that you're literally talking about, like pulling in advice and doing all the things, the better it's going to be to help you figure out where your hurdles are in these kind of, is it a sunk cost fallacy? Is it emotional decision-making, things like that? And but
it's important to know too, like your natural style might change depending on what the decision is, right? Yes. And so being able to recognize that and then being able to have people on your team, or within your board of directors, within your, kind of mentorship circle that can guide and direct you based off of where you feel like you're going down a path that may not be right.
Yeah, because don't you work with leaders so often where there's almost this pressure because they've decided to do something that they feel like they have to have the answers. Yeah. And so really having that self-awareness and other people that can also, like, you trust them to be honest with it, can really help with that. So, so with that, like if we're really working within this world, how can we make effective decisions then? Still quickly, hopefully, and without really sacrificing quality or getting overwhelmed by, the analysis paralysis or the other things that are really happening amongst the moment we have to make this decision.
The steps feel easy, but in practice, they're actually really hard, right? And so exactly. So prioritization, right? Like what are the critical decisions? Focus on those first. I think it's Steve Jobs who really became quite famous for like always wearing the same outfit, right? I think Mark Zuckerberg as well. And it's like taking out the decisions that you don't need to make on a daily basis so that you're only making critical decisions. Delegation, right? So empowering your team to make decisions sort of within their area of responsibility. There's a really cool principle that I like to use there, which is the one-way door or the two-way door. And so empowering your team that if a decision is a two-way door, it means that you can walk through and then you can walk back. So it's a decision where it's not permanent, right? You can tell your team, as long as it's something that can be undone, go for it, right? Make the decision, make the call, and we can always walk it back. Whereas a one-way door is like, once you've made this decision, we cannot walk it back. In that case, it's not delegatable, right? Is that even a word?
I've never heard that analogy, and I love it. That's such a good way to think about, like, how important is this decision?
Even in life, right? Like even for you personally, right? As you're thinking about it, like, can I undo this decision? If so, like, why am I spending all this time? Like, let me just make the decision, see how it turns out, and have actionable evidence. Heuristics, right? So like, what are the mental shortcuts? Like, what are the things that I can do to simplify those complex decisions? Like, how can I put them into a framework? Time boxing is what I'm big on. And my husband did this to me on my website where he was like, you have 1 hour to decide the photo that you want on your website and you better decide or else you're getting nothing. So like, don't get bogged down. Don't overthink it. It's really great for those of us who are like analysis paralysis. And then there is a little bit of intuition. I have found that some founders trust their intuition way too much. And so I'm always like a little nervous to recommend it. But I do feel there are some people who probably don't trust it enough. And so it is worth mentioning. But if your team or other people in your life have told you, hey, you trust your gut a little too much, maybe back off of that one and use something that's a little bit more tried and true.
That's really good. I listened to this woman on another podcast. And if I can remember what her name is, I'm going to put it in the show notes. And if anyone else listening, if it's not in the show notes and you know her name, you should definitely comment. But she was so wise because she was talking about how you should stop procrastinating on making a decision because you're trying to make the right decision. And you should instead just make the decision right. Meaning sometimes it's just the act of making the decision and then figuring out, was in fact that the right decision? Is that too much of my gut? Is it whatever? And sometimes that's really what you want to do. Definitely calling back to the two-way door versus one-way door conversation. But a lot of times we overthink that moment versus getting data as that decision is made and quickly pivoting back or doing something different.
Right.
So with all of this sort of like overview of our traps, and then even just like how we can kind of practice getting better, which I love that kind of concept. Are there specific frameworks? So getting really into the details that can make us more informed and strategic about the decisions we're making. And really for our startup leaders, I would say, especially in high pressure scenarios.
So one of the things that we talked about in my class were decision trees or decision matrices, right? So really being able to kind of put on paper all the different options that could happen as a result of your decision, or what are you deciding between, right? So I'm deciding to expand my production. What are the things that could happen? I could decide to expand, or I don't have to decide to expand. There's probably an investment cost with expanding. Let's say I expand and there's high demand or low demand. And then by putting it in the decision tree, I find that it's so much easier to start to think about, okay, if I decide to expand for sure, then what kind of mechanisms would I put in place that if the demand wasn't high, it was low, how could I increase that demand? Or how could I decrease the supply that I'm producing once I've decided the demand isn't there, right? And I think by visually looking at it, it might help people to start to think about, because it becomes less unknown and more known. Another is...
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second, because I think you said something that I don't want to be missed by people listening. I have talked to a lot of leaders who say something like, well, I'm thinking about it. Like, I just haven't written it down yet. And I'm like, no.
Famous last words.
You have to write it down. There is a critical mind to decision process with putting it on paper. So I'm going to just double down on what you had to say before you keep going.
There is. The other piece is a cost benefit analysis, right? So start to really think, what are the potential costs, right? What are the benefits of each side of this decision? And how does that weigh into what you're going to ultimately decide? And then there's the basics, which is the SWOT analysis, right? So what are the strengths, the weaknesses, what's the opportunity of this decision? What are some threats related to that decision? Or what is the opportunity cost of not going after something that you're trying to decide about? I love pre-mortems. Is it taboo to like them? But basically, imagine you've made the decision, get together with your team, pretend the decision's been made, and then have everyone in the room shoot holes in it and tell you why it failed and what the reasons are why it failed. And then that way you can start to think about how to be proactive about mitigating those risks. So we love a good postmortem, but what if you were actually able to get ahead of some of those problems by doing a pre-mortem?
That is so smart, especially because, by the time you do a postmortem, valuable, necessary, absolutely you should do it, but there's nothing you can do about what went wrong at that point.
You can only fix it for the next time.
That's right.
And you might not have the exact same decision next time, right? All the factors might be very different. Whereas in a pre-mortem, you're really equipping your team. You're also, not for nothing, creating psychological safety by allowing your team to point out things they feel are wrong with the decision, which could help you ultimately come to a better decision, potentially, or could help with the change management of getting your team on board with the choice. And then second order thinking, this is another place where decision trees are helpful. So it's what are the consequences of the decision beyond just the very immediate impact? So what are the things that are going to be trickling down once I've made this choice? And this goes back again to that two-way door, one-way door, right? If I'm able to deal with those consequences ahead of time, or know how I'm going to deal with the consequences ahead of time, I'm much more likely to be willing to kind of go through that door, because I know that I can handle, or my team can handle, anything that might come as a result of it. If I'm unable to know and I'm not really sure, then maybe I do need to take the step back and really kind of think about the decision on a much more macro level.
I think that that's really great. And I have one final question for you, but I'm going to answer it first to give you a second to think about it. My question is, if at the end of the day, they still can't make a decision, what do you do? And I have a answer and a spicy answer. And then I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Spicy answer.
So, yeah, spicy answer. So my regular answer is going to be get someone to help you. Someone that has been there, done that outside of your organization, or a board member or an advisor, like not a friend, not a whatever, but like someone who has experience to share on making that decision. My spicy answer would be ask yourself if you then are the right person to be making that decision, because maybe you don't have the tools you need to be able to make the decision you need about whatever the thing is. And I think that there's a huge amount of humility that is humility, anyway, that goes into being able to acknowledge that maybe you need someone else to make that decision. And that person could be inferior to your role, frankly. Like, it doesn't have to be like someone who's, greater or whatever, like if you're looking at a hierarchical like structure. But what do you think, Katrina? Like, if all else
your spicy answer was my main answer. So there's that.
Oh, I like it.
And then the other piece of it is starting to think about the value of perfect information, right? So what are you missing? What do you feel like you have to know or has to be true in order for the decision to be easier? And then is that information something that you actually can acquire? And if it is something you can acquire, how much would it cost? And then when you start to think about the ROI, you can decide, like, is it worth acquiring that information? Is it worth looking for it? I think the other piece of it is just starting to be, again, resilient, as we talked about. Like, if you make a decision and it goes wrong, being able to adjust and pivot and being able to kind of handle whatever gets thrown at you, as opposed to living in the fear of making the decision.
That's great. That's really good. Well, this has been another great episode of the Managed Chaos podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. You can follow and subscribe on YouTube to help us get to our goal of 5,000 followers this year. You can also follow or subscribe to Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. And we'll definitely talk to you next time on the next episode of the Managed Chaos podcast.